They're in Washington just because they're in the United States and foreign policy continues to dominate the news. We went out on the streets and tried to get a sampling of how the people here, of course it's not a scientific sample, but it's a range of opinions about how people feel about the U.S. foreign policy towards Iran, towards Israel, and towards the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And we want to hear what some of those opinions are and get your feedback on it.
Our policy has been wrong-headed for a long, long time. We should long since have reached some kind of settlement. We're leaving the country next door to Iran, so it's always going to have a predominant influence.
Part of their foreign policy involves the, if not the downfall of America, bad things happening to America. Signs all over the country, down to the USA. Pretty simple as to why that would be problematic for us.
I think America's foreign policy is often not the best, sometimes a little harsh, and sometimes not harsh enough in the right places.
I think that for the most part right now, unfortunately, we're a pretty undereducated society as to the real origins of our foreign policy. So I think that most people just sort of take whatever gets said by their congressman to be the truth and to be what's best, and that's not necessarily the case when you look at some of the historical moves that we've made.
I've always thought it was a little bit unfair when the countries that already have the weapons are trying to keep everybody else from getting the weapons.
Anything we can do to keep nuclear weapons out of the reach of as many countries as possible is to the good.
There are bigger dangers in the world today than Iran when it comes to nuclear weapons.
They're the bad guys right now that are identifiably bad. We always need an enemy. We always need a bad guy. Can't blame the Russians anymore, and the Chinese are our biggest customers. So,
well, I think if you go back historically and look at the fact that we implemented and helped with the coup in Iran years ago, I think that's still very much a sore spot. Even when you look now with the oil situation with BP, for example, how all of that gets tied in, and when you have people in Congress who, prior to being congressmen, a lot of times revolved around the oil business, that industry, I think that they're trying to keep Iran as far as possible away so that we as the American public don't really understand the full history of our relationship with them.
We're never going to settle that until the Arab-Israeli, Palestinian-Israeli conflict is settled, and that's one of those conflicts that may not be settled in my lifetime, but I've been surprised before.
I think there's not a very balanced view here in the United States about Israel. I think, we fail to recognize the legitimate rights of the Palestinians in Palestine. And so, I mean, it's been shown over and over that we can't control Israel, even though we're their patron.
Israel's a unique situation. And as long as Israel is our ally, there's going to be problems there. But they are a dependable ally, and so we need to cultivate them. On the other hand, we need to somehow bring some sort of peace and stability there. And how that's going to happen, I have no idea, but whoever can pull that off certainly deserves a Nobel Peace Prize.
When you bring Israel into the issue, I think that there's definitely a whole lot there with our relationship with Israel that is not really clearly explained to people, and so I think that we as a country would be better served trying to educate as a whole all of the constituency so that we as American people have an idea of what's going on, because right now there's really no one could tell you why we always support Israel. We just know we're supposed to, basically.
Well, that's a wide sample of pretty interesting opinions. One of the people there on the street, one of the men on the street interviews, alluded to the fact that the U.S. was involved in a coup. And I think the coup that he's referring to is the overthrow of the Mohammed Mossadeq government in Iran in 1953. When President Obama spoke in Cairo on June 4th, 2009, in an address widely described as an appeal to the Muslim world, it was the first time that a U.S. president acknowledged that, even though it was still somewhat obliquely, that the U.S. was a factor in the overthrow of a democratically elected government. And then the Shah of Iran was placed on the throne, and when the Shah came to the throne, he denationalized oil, the Anglo-Iranian oil company, which we now know as BP, and he alluded to the Gulf of Mexico. He denationalized it, and it went back to, it reverted to Western powers, to American and British oil companies. And then the Shah remained on the throne for 26 years. And the man on the street said, well, that has to be something of a sore spot. And that might be like a grand historical understatement. How do the Iranians view this, Ray McGovern? How do they view the relationship? Is that the context? Is it the fact that the United States overthrew the government once, denationalized and took the oil back, and they want to do it again? Is that, do you think, how some Iranians or most Iranians view it?
Well, every Iranian school child is familiar with the history. It's a very bitter history. You know, this was the time when it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. You know, my Irish grandfather explained to me why that was. He said, the good Lord would never trust the British in the dark. In any case, when Mossadeq was freely elected, one of the first things he did was to nationalize the oil extraction there. And of course, that it did belong to BP's predecessor, and that was just not to be done in those days, you know. And so the British said to the very fledgling CIA, just 4 years old, hey, look what's happened here. Let us show you what we do in such circumstances when people start to believe that the oil under their territory belongs to them rather than to British Petroleum. And long story short, they did a coup and put in a very, very repressive regime. The Shah and his Savak secret police are among the most savage in the world. And so that's 1953 up until 1979. Iranians lived through that period. The Shah was propped up by us. And so there's a great deal of resentment. There's a great deal of history there. And when, of course, they captured or they took over the U.S. Embassy in '79, then the resentment came from the other direction, from the U.S. How could you do that?
Let me ask you, Ivan, that during the time that the Shah was on the throne and a principal ally of the United States in this vital region of the world, the U.S. not only knew of but encouraged the development of Iran's nuclear program. Wasn't that the history of Iran in the 1960s and 70s?
Well, certainly at the time, the Shah was considered an ally of the United States, and for example, the Tehran research reactor, which they're discussing now, was built by the Americans, and there was extensive both military and technical cooperation between the United States and the Shah. There's no question about that. That's the whole era of installing the Shah. I think that there's anybody who knows the history, and I have to admit that most Americans probably do not. Well, I'm sure that most Americans do not.
But it would be helpful to them if they did.
It would, but then you have to make the distinction. Because the Shah's regime was repressive, and another revolutionary government came in to replace the repressive Shah, does not mean that the government that replaced it is necessarily a government that is going to be friendly and nice to the people. And I think there are clearly problems with the current Iranian government that the Iranian people understand that they have a problem with the Iranian government. I think that part of the resentment toward the United States is that the United States, through the coup, not only set in motion the regime of the Shah, but the counter-reaction to the Shah that leaves them with the government that they have now, which they're not entirely happy with. And so, we're not only responsible in a way for the Shah's regime, but we're responsible in an indirect way because by putting the Shah for the current government. And the Iranian people have complaints about the Shah, which are perfectly legitimate, and they have complaints about their current government, which I think are